Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this CCFG webinar. My name is Bill Mason. I'm the chair of the CCFG and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. We're delighted today to welcome Charlie Taylor, who a friend and a colleague from way back in forest research, and who, following his stint in forest research, went to what was probably Perth Forest District at the time, and then became Tay Forest District, based in one of the most beautiful parts of Scotland. Charlie's been there for the best part of 30 years, and during that time he's been instrumental in expanding the use of continuous cover forestry within the public forest estate, both in Perthshire and also inspiring colleagues up and down Britain to undertake wider use of continuous cover forestry. So we're honoured to have Charlie to talk to us today to try and sum up his experience of 30 years of applying CCF in Perthshire. He'll talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll have questions and answers. Please put your questions into the chat box and I'll attempt to moderate those for a half hour or so of questions after the full talk. So Charlie, welcome, the floor's yours.
Okay, thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just try and share my screen now. Okay, everybody. 30 years of attempting to apply continuous, and I say the word attempting, in Perthshire, but also in Angus, northeast Fife, and one or two other corners as well. And that's 30 years of head scratching with colleagues, making mistakes, but gradually, over time, acquiring some knowledge, which I'll try and share with you today. Disclaimer: I think every talk like this should have a disclaimer, and limited intelligence was used in this construction of this, as you'll find out as we go through it. Location: it's where I worked was in East Central Scotland. Interesting, as Bill said, a very attractive part of the world, but interesting because the Highland boundary fault split it in two. To the north and west, you're in true highlands, and to the south and east, you're in the lowlands of Scotland. As a result, there was a massive variety of sites, from peat bogs in the west to sand dunes in the east and everything in between, all scattered through the catchment of the River Tay, which is the biggest river in Scotland. So from the northwest in the Highland part of the district, from Loch Rannoch in the distance to through Loch Tummel, down through the Tay Valley, past Dunkeld, going into lowland Perthshire, and then from lowland Perthshire into Fife. So incredible variety of sites and a wide range of forest types. And so the range of forests included things from native pine woods in the Rannoch area, the Blackwood of Rannoch, through long established conifer forests, some parts of which dated back to the 18th century, unusual in Scotland, and also some lowland broadleaf forests. So an interesting range of forests to work on. And of course, one of our most celebrated forests is Faskley Forest, a continuous cover forest, which is lit up at certain times of year to become the enchanted forest, and has a whole number of tourists coming through it every autumn. Okay, challenge: how do you condense 30 years into 30 minutes? That was a question that Bill posed to me. I thought, well, I could maybe talk to my younger self. What would I say to my younger self starting all those years ago? But knowing myself, I probably wouldn't have listened. First piece of advice: probably go and live in the Western Isles. A lot less people, hardly any trees. Life would be an awful lot simpler. But anyway, assuming I wouldn't have taken that advice, first lesson: have clear, agreed managed objectives for your site or sites. Not an original thought, as many will realise, and it's the gospel according to Karen Mason. And it's along the thing, it's about practicing CCF is not a management objective. It's what you use when it's the best approach to deliver objectives for the site. So be clear on that. You know, CCF is not the objective, it's a means to achieving the objective. Second lesson, and this really, I think this is really important, enable a range of options for future managers. You know, try not to reduce the options that you inherit, and ideally widen the range of options for the future. And it's the best approximation I've found for sustainable forest management, by getting the right balance. And we don't know what the future holds. The forests I've found the most interesting to manage are the ones where I've been passed a range of options. And I feel it's our duty to pass on a wide range of options as possible to our successors. And we say, we don't know what the future holds. Well, we know climate change is happening. Pests and diseases are becoming an increasing concern for us. More storm events are happening, and are likely to continue. And biodiversity crisis, you know, we're seeing the biggest rate of extinctions around the world. And, you know, how do we get back to having more diverse habitats? How do we take a lot of what in the uplands are first rotation plantations and turn them into managed forests? And we don't know what the future needs are. You know, when those people having a walk there 100 years ago, they couldn't have predicted what society would want now. We can't predict what the trees we're looking at now will be required for in the future. Will it just be about fibre? Will it be a new industrial fuel stock that we'll be producing? We can't tell, so you have to keep those options open. Right, third lesson. This is keep it simple. Don't be bamboozled by the jargon of CCF or LIS or ATC or LIMA, the new one that's given LIMA, or close to nature forestry or whatever else. You know, there's an awful lot of jargon bandied about in relation to CCF. And the CCF group is on my alternative title here. It doesn't actually apply. You know, it's a group of folk that get together to chat about things, and it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to make it complicated to be successful in continuous cover forestry. And keeping this thing of keeping it simple, you know, you do have to briefly outline the best silviculture approach to delivering objectives. It's always it's on the spectrum from clear fell at one end of the spectrum to selection system at the other. So you have to describe where you'll best meet the objectives by choosing a system somewhere on that. This is a continuum. These do not suddenly jump from one to the other. They are a continuum, but you try to describe whereabouts in that continuum you are. Include a simple prescription, a long-term vision of what you think that site should look like in terms of structure and in terms of species you'd hope to be there. And then at the minimum, the next management intervention. You don't have to go mad. You don't have to prescribe the next 100 years. You could if you wish. Nobody will actually follow it and guarantee it. So you want to have the minimum in there that you pass on to your success. You have to assume you've got an intelligent successor who will pick up what you think you were trying to do, and they will run with it and adapt it to their time and improve on it, hopefully. All the rest of the effort you put into large fancy plans is often wasted. Just keep it simple as possible. Again, keeping it simple. Don't be put off by the narrow definitions of CCF. You know, often people just talk about, you know, it can only be about certain very small interventions in the forest. If you did that in the uplands, you wouldn't hardly ever practice what I would class as continuous cover forestry. It's along the lines of, you know, a preference for natural regeneration. It's adapting the site, your management to the site. It's diversifying species. Above all, for me, it's about maintaining forest conditions. And we've talked now a lot about natural capital and ecosystem services, and CCF for me has a significant role to play in that, in terms of providing a wide range of ecosystem services and continuity of service as well. So I'll maybe just slow down because it's maybe taking a wee while to come through. So Bear Hill, that's where we started last century. We then spent a long time developing forest conditions over many decades. Okay, and then we go back, we clear fell large areas at the end of the first rotation and restock them. I say I'm not decrying that as a system. We'll be using it in much of the uplands for the foreseeable future, but it does narrow the options. You're basically back to Bear Hill again, and the species range is going to be equally narrow to it was the first time round. Okay. Same forest further down, where we had a mixed stand of Scots pine and Sitka, not mixed and intimately mixed, but in different areas on different rotation lengths. So the pine wasn't particularly well thinned, but not clear felling the whole lot at one time. We ended up creating fairly large gaps that wouldn't be classic continuous cover, but because there's a seed source round and we've still got relatively, for me in the uplands forestry conditions, infilled with natural regeneration of a much wider range of species than we'd ever consider planting. And for me, in the uplands, I would class that as continuous cover forestry. So it doesn't have to be necessarily classic, if you like, selection systems and shelterwood systems. It's just recognizing opportunities and in identifying places where you don't always have to clear fell on a large scale. Okay, and the other aspect of keeping it simple is the Holy Grail isn't a selection system. It's not the end point you must always strive towards. And certainly uplands, it's not going to be the case. If colleague and friend Jens Haufer, he basically gave me this data here, which is, you know, that in many areas in the continent where they're much further ahead with continuous cover than we are, it's a very low percentage that they have under selection systems. Even in somewhere like Switzerland, where we know protection forest is really important, it's still a relatively small proportion. Having said that, in Britain and certainly in Scotland, we would barely register 0.1, 0.2%, I suspect, in selection. So certainly in Scotland, it would be very low percentage. So there's still scope for it, but it's not the Holy Grail. You don't have to be striving for that and to be practicing CCF. Okay, fourth lesson, be bold. You know, you have to thin early, get in as early as you can. Certainly in the uplands, it's really important. Another technique I would recommend is graduate density thinning, developed by Talis Carnar in Central Wales, and I saw it in the 90s, and sort of enhanced and developed and adopted by Phil Morgan. And there's a really good, if you want a bit more detail on that, because it's a really applicable system in the uplands. Phil did a previous webinar in this series, which is on YouTube, and it's worth going into that. It's about, it really does work well in the uplands in terms of when you've got sites that don't have a huge amount of brash and are wetter conditions. And the next thing is initiate crown thinning as soon as you can. It doesn't make for greater stability, and it also allows you to get a high yield in the early stages. Not such a problem in the current climate in terms of timber prices, but in times when timber prices aren't as good, it's very helpful. And this bit, really, really important, you know, actively control deer populations across the whole forest. Minimize your fencing. In the uplands, when you're often operating against different land uses, you may have to maintain a marsh fence, but within the forest, as much as possible, manage deer by controlling the deer population rather than putting in small fence enclosures. The benefits are much greater because you get regeneration across the whole forest. Easy to say, not so easy to do, but it's really, really important. Fifth lesson, sometimes you need to be patient. You know, a regeneration period can be the length of your career. It's a kind of novel concept to many of us who grew up with sort of clear fell and restocking as our bread and butter. But, you know, don't use that as an excuse for inactivity. There will be occasions where it's fairly obvious what the barriers are to achieving regeneration, and you have to tackle those. Sometimes it's deer, sometimes it's cultivation, sometimes it's lack of seed source. You just have to be aware of those things. Sixth lesson, be adaptable, absolutely critical. You know, respond to what you see. If birch fills in your regeneration coop when you hoped it was going to be something else, can you make something of it? Rather than kill it, can you clean it and turn it into a crop and have a cash crop of birch for a period? Monitoring is important. You don't have to go mad, but you do have to monitor, because it's particularly helpful when you're trying to explain to other people what you're trying to do on any scale, or you want investment or make a change. For example, this is Fascally record keeping just enough. You don't have to go mad. This is us trying to work out in Fascally, which is a selection forest, what area we want, what size of trees we want to do the thinning on. So we put in 2 transects across the site, measure the diameter range, plotted it out against the classic, if you like, reverse J-curve, and began to recognise that was the area we needed to target harder when we're doing the thinning to try and release more space for regen going forward. You don't have to have massive records. It's been really, I've always found that really challenging to retain records over any length of time. Anything that informs the next operation, really important. Things will happen, you know. You'll wake up one morning and you'll find the area that's been tended for many years has been flattened. This is part of Craigrinion Forest in Perthshire near Dunkeld after storms a number of years ago, and many unfortunately will have woken up to this is sort of seen this winter. But once you get past that initial shock and you start to clear it up and remove the timber, and you suddenly realise you don't have to take all the trees away. The standing trees are still pretty stable. And if the stand hadn't been so well thinned, or hadn't been unthinned as other parts of the forest, we'd have been clearing much larger areas in storm events to get to green edge, to get to stable edge. So it can minimise the impact of storm damage. This is a quote I liked. It's not mine, I wish it was. It's that sort of combination, you know, you need good data and science to support, to give you evidence. But forest is a bit of an art. It comes down to a judgment. It's not my quote. This is Talis Kalnar's again. But you know, it's that balance between having data and science and recognizing what you see yourself and learning about the forest. In this thing about being adaptable, there's a range of thinning issues you will come up against, or I've come up against. Timber prices fluctuate. We're in an incredible period just now where timber prices are booming. Unbelievable. It's not going to last. It will not last. And when it does drop, you've got to find clever ways of packaging things together to keep those first early thinnings going. Those first 2-3 thinnings are absolutely critical. You get a bit more scope after you get through that period, in terms you don't have to be quite so quick. You know, you've got a bit more flexibility, but in those first 2 or 3 thinnings, you have to be at them fairly early on and fairly quick after each other. So you have to find ways of packaging in difficult markets to be able to sell and work those areas. Machine type, if you're in the uplands and working on any scale, you're going to be working with harvester forwarder systems. It's not ideal, but you have to make it work for you. You've got to try and get the right size of machine in terms of size of width of machine, reach of machine, and obviously the weight of the machine. Absolutely key. And it will be a challenge because there's not many of the smaller machines out there. All the contractors and so on want to go for bigger machines that are more flexible. And coupled with that is a person that actually works the machine. And you know, you see some folk, I'm very envious of colleagues in the private sector and particularly in the States who are able to heft contractors to it. In public sector, we're not able to do that. It's just not the way we're able to procure things. So as a result, you know, colleagues have to spend time with contractors early on site, trying to get them tuned into what you're trying to do. You won't have the luxury of marking the whole stand, given the scale you'll be operating on. So you have to work with them and mark a sample area and be with them in the early days. If you don't make that investment, you will be chasing your tail, because the speed these guys go at, they cover a lot of ground. So you've got to invest hard and early with these folk to get them up to speed as best you can up to speed. It will not be perfect, but gradually they will get better. The other part of that is certainly, in my experience, is turnover of site managers, and I'll come back to that. We're often talking about long-term management prescriptions, and you know, between thinnings there'll be new site managers, and during an establishment phase there'll be a range of site managers. So you have to think through how you overcome that. Then of regeneration issues. Sometimes we get too much regeneration. Sometimes we get too little. It sounds like Goldilocks, but it's happening, and you get it scattered as well. It's across large areas. Certainly when you're operating in an upland situation that's across large areas, how do you get a cleaning program together on that when it's so scattered and it's on such a scale? Generation issues, again, you know, enrichment, how and when do you decide to enrich? Browsing, you're now moving into, if you're beginning to get regeneration, you're moving into a different set of issues for people to manage deer. We've got much more cover within the forest. Comes back to contractor skills and availability again, both in terms of managing the deer population, but also in terms of carrying out the cleaning operations. And again, that's an investment in terms of getting folk clued into what you're trying to do. And turnover of site managers, it applies right through the spectrum. And certainly when you get into this larger organisation like the one I work for, people tend to specialise. The only way I found that you can sensibly overcome that is to get folk to operate in much more local teams, geographically based teams who have ownership of parts of the district, and they work together, and they take ownership of what they see, and they start to notice the areas where we're getting some regeneration that's going to require cleaning. So they pass it on to the person who's going to be carrying out the cleaning. Vice versa, people are sharing information, so you want those communication lines to be as short as possible. So small local teams. The other thing is when one manager moves on, they drop, whoever comes in new to that area drops into a team of folk. They're not sitting on their own. So that's the best way I've found in larger scale and larger organisations to dealing with issues that come up in terms of regeneration and thinning and continuous cover. 7th lesson, keep learning. You've just got to keep working at it. Learn from other people's successes and failures. It's by far the best and cheapest and easiest way to do it. Webinars, I found that really helpful during lockdown. It's been one of the upsides of lockdown. There's a lot more accessibility to good information. But now as things open up, nothing beats being out in the forest. Sharing experiences with long-standing managers like Gareth Browning in the Lakes and Jim Colchester of Blackley Estates, being out with these folk on their site, seeing what they're doing, it makes a huge difference to your understanding. CCFG meetings, plug for that. They're great events, you just have to avoid the man with the purple hat at these events. But they're a great way for networking and seeing what's going on in other places. Get around the country, at CCFG events, and if you can, get abroad. Trips to Europe. It seems like there are actually a surprising number of similarities to the issues they face in Europe than we face. They've got longer experience of us than we have, so it's a great place to go and learn about CCF. And also, on those trips, you make improves your network, increases your connections. And if you can, certainly if you're working in the uplands and you're working with species like Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, or western hemlock, try and get to Northwest America. When you see those species in their native environment, it is mind-blowing if you've been operating in this country. And if you don't think they have a place in continuous cover after you've been there, you've got no soul. So in summary, clear management objective, have that right up the top. Enable options for the future. Keep it simple. Keep it as simple as you can. Be bold, get on and do something, get on and try and get started. Sometimes you have to be patient. Above all, be adaptable and keep learning. And I'll just go back, I jumped there too far. But if you actually are successful in that, you will create interesting managed forests out of the plantations that many of us are inheriting, which will have a wide range of attributes and be much more robust and resilient for the future with a much wider range of products than the ones we are inheriting. And finally, if you apply more than half of these lessons, you'll be twice the forester I ever was. Okay, I'll stop sharing now, Bill.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlie.
I've got myself back on screen here. Hold on a sec. Stop share, hold on, that's me.
Okay, Charlie.
Let's stop sharing.
Yeah, okay, Grant, we've got a few questions. And I suppose the first one, which Simon Hart raised, was when you introduced CCF into places like Craigvinian, what were the objectives you thought CCF would meet?
Okay, good question, Simon. In Craigbinion, we had, set in the lower slopes, we had a lot of mature Norway spruce planted in the 1940s, which was a valuable timber resource. It was also a critical component in the national scenic area, heavily used by the public for recreation, and also in a really important red squirrel stronghold. And when you began to think through all those things, and those were you had to get all those objectives into play. It became increasingly clear that the best way of retaining the habitat, maintaining the landscape, and continuing to harvest continuous cover using shelterwood systems was the most appropriate way to go forward. If we'd the original plan was to do clear felling. If we'd done that, we'd have certainly damaged the habitat, would have impacted on the landscape. Yes, we'd have had a good hit on income, but we'd have also had a fairly major hit on expenditure as well.
And when you started, was that a major difficulty to persuade your colleagues to run with this?
Fairly significant. I would say Craigbinion was the first sort of well, it's an early tranche of when we got into forest planning in what was Forest Enterprise Scotland back then. And we made a bold commitment to, I think it was about something like 200 hectares of continuous cover in Craigbinion. It's a forest of about 2,000 hectares. To do that, we actually had to have a Forestry Commission Great Britain board meeting on site to agree that, because that was way beyond not only my pay grade, but my boss's pay grade and the Director General's pay grade to be this radical. But after a site visit, they agreed as an exception, they would consider it to be done. Of course, a lot of the stuff back then, the constraint was in revenue forgone. And within a few years, that had gone as being a constraint. And it was easier to roll out to other places, as long as it was the best way of meeting the objectives of management. But it was a challenge to start with, I won't deny it. And what was an equal challenge is that we didn't know what we were doing. And it was desperately scrabbling around trying to find, certainly in the Scottish context, people, particularly in the private sector and private estates, who could maybe advise us on how to do it. There was very limited, certainly within our organisation, very limited experience.
Thank you. Question from Adam Thorogood down in Wales. And it's a kind of comment, is that from what you said, it would appear that procurement systems and production targets can be a constraint on the uptake and practice of CCF.
Yeah,
do you want to comment?
I would say production targets shouldn't be. I mean, the production targets shouldn't be a constraint to continuous cover. That, if you're doing your land management, your long-term planning that includes continuous cover, then that drives the production, if you like, rather than the other way around. I would agree that procurement, the way we have to do procurement in the public sector, does put a constraint on getting the right machine and the right person at the right time. That is very challenging, particularly if you've got larger contracts and you're operating on a larger scale. The only way you get around that is by, unfortunately, stretched staff having to spend time in the early days with these contractors. And that's particularly challenging when the operator changes. You just have to be fairly tough in your contract management to get, if it's not working out, you're often working with large outfits. You want a new operator, please, and you just keep working until you get one that you can work with. So that's not so easy, but it can be done. Having said that, most operators, once you get them into it, they really enjoy it. It's different. They have to think about things. So it's not often not a chore. It's an investment in time, and that's a challenge for folk to spend that time. But you've got to do it at the start, because these things move so fast. If you don't do it at the start on a sample and get them tuned into it right at the start, you're going to be chasing your tail thereafter.
There's a question from, thank you, Charlie. There's a question come through from Graham Gill, which I suppose ties into the graduated density thinning.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
if you go on to soft ground, does this become a problem in finding permanent extraction racks?
I think when you're in the uplands, certainly if you're on the better ground, permanent extraction routes, if you get freely draining soils, permanent extraction routes are the way to go. And a lot of our sites, we don't have that luxury, and the graduated density thinning is a good approach in the early days. It gets more challenging, as Graham's maybe suggesting there, as you get into the later stages, because when you do the graduated density thinning, the first two interventions, you're on fresh racks, so you've got plenty of brash. After that, you've got to start paying for folk to move brash around. You've also got to recognise that not all your site is going to be subject to thinning or CCF. As you put racks in, you start to see that parts of the site you're just racking through. You're not actually going to thin them. You're just going to use them to rack through to get the rest of the site. So don't necessarily have to attempt to thin all the rack. And that's about getting whoever's sitting on the machine tuned into it. When they come to wet bit, just rack through it. Don't attempt to thin it. And if you get to checked areas, you can start to harvest some of that to put into those wet areas to cross. So you've got to pay extra to get that done, to hold the machines up. So that is a challenge in a lot of these more upland sites in the wetter conditions. So it comes back to that being adaptable. You don't have to thin the whole site, but you may have to rack through the whole site.
Okay, thanks. And Gary's asked, if management objective is your most important lesson, what's the second most important?
Did I say it was the most important? They're all important, Gary. But I think it's a starting point. It's what drives everything else. The second most important, I'm not sure I've ranked them. I think there was 7 as well, Gary. There wasn't 8. But of the 7, they're all important. I think being adaptable is really important. But so is learning. They're all important in their own way. Keep learning, keep going to new places, finding out about new ideas. I've been at this for over 30 years. God, I've only scratched the surface in terms of learning. Every time I go to a CCFG event, I learn something new, or I make a new connection, a new contact that I can follow up. So yeah, I wouldn't say there's a second most important one. I would say maybe clear management objectives is definitely number 1. You've got to have that at the start. The other 6 are equally important.
Thanks. And Alan Gales asked you the impossible question as to whether there's a right balance between clearfell and CCF in Scotland.
No.
I'll partially answer. They'll say there should be more CCF. But there's
I would agree, Bill. Alan, thank you for that question, Alan. Will there ever be a right balance? I think there's definitely scope for more in Scotland. If you look at the site types we have, we're underplaying it at the moment. And certainly in our organisation and across the sector, we're really stretched just now with huge demands, trying to recruit new staff to meet rising programmes. It's a boom period. One of the consequences of the boom period is the challenge about getting new folk in and getting them embedded in the system and getting them trained up and so on, and getting all the mentoring put in place. So it's a real challenge to do all those things. But I'm an optimist. A lot of the sites we're moving on to now, some of the sites we planted in the 70s and 80s, it's a real struggle to get continuous cover going in those. The older forests planted in the 50s and 60s further down the hill with a wide range of species, we should be doing more there. And as we move into better sites, the slightly better sites that we're now beginning to plant in Scotland, the scope is actually growing. We'll be planting a wider range of species on better sites. I think the future looks really rosy, but we could be trying harder just now. I don't think we're trying as hard as we could on the sites we already have.
Great, thanks. And then Philip Gordon has asked something that you and I have debated at intervals. Options for CCF in sitka dominated stands or forests, and the role of shade tolerant species. Yeah,
good question, Phil. Yeah, one of the challenges with Sitka, certainly as you move into sort of P-tier sites, as folk will have experienced in the southern uplands in Wales, and I've seen in parts of Perthshire as well. As you open up these stands, you get a massive wave of Sitka regen, sometimes too much. You almost get too much, and I know that's a challenge about trying. I've seen like folk in Clochina trying to manage light conditions to keep it down, but it's a real challenge to get citrus. It isn't ubiquitous. I would agree. Enrichment, that's a good place for considering enrichment, and I would certainly say, a lot of species that folk are looking as alternative species now, things like western red cedar, silver fir, and so on. That seems to me the rather than putting those onto new planting sites or onto clearfell sites, the best place to put those is enrichment. They need investment. You don't need to go mad. You're providing a seed source maybe for the future, next generation of forests. It's about that, creating more options, so you don't have to put huge numbers in, but you're starting the seed source for the next rotation round. So I would certainly advocate enrichment of those species in those sites.
Okay. It may also be that with Sitka you have to consider not the classical intimate silvicultural systems. You accept wider gaps.
Yeah. I think, I hope I've got that across in the presentation. In the uplands, you've got to be that adaptable thing. You are putting sometimes some quite big holes in your forest, but it's not as big as, if you like, clear fells. They're not classic continuous cover forestry. But if you're able to get natural regeneration and you keep them in a lot of forest conditions, they are continuous cover forestry for me.
Okay, and comment from Gary about keep thinning, control the deer, and aim for diversity, which I think you.
Yeah, and usually when I say it in field, there's a few more sweary words in it. But it's that thing. If you keep thinning and you keep on top of deer, and you introduce a bit of diversity, you will get continuous cover forestry. It's not rocket science. It really isn't. It's hard work to do those things, to get the thinning, keep the thinning program up, get on top of the deer. If you do that, it's amazing what you will achieve. Things will happen, and then you are in a happy position of having to deal with lots of regen.
Just developing that for a second, and your comment that it's hard work, is there also an issue here of being patient? It'll take you 5 years or more to start to see the results. Yeah,
no, it definitely. An early indication a lot of upland sites is what's happening along your roadsides. And that's why I use as a trigger for me about that we were beginning to get on top of deer numbers when I began to see a lot of soft species beginning to appear in the roadsides. The conditions weren't maybe right in the stands yet, but I was beginning to see them in the roadsides and begin to be comfortable where we're getting there. Of course, it creates a new set of issues in that you may have to increase your road and drains maintenance for all this regen you're getting, but that's a nice problem to have. But I think, so that was always an early indicator in a lot of these big upland forests for me, where we actually beginning to make inroads into the deer population. It was a good guide for me. And then, if you get the right conditions in the stand, regen begins to happen. But as you say, it takes a while. It doesn't happen immediately overnight. But again, you've got to be careful you're not too patient as well, because sometimes you're waiting for something that's never going to happen. Okay, and then Ted Wilson has commented from Ireland. Curious for you to know a bit more about the limits. Yeah, sites that are generally wet, they're not good candidates. And the shallow rooting, you're not going to get good CCF in those. And I would still be in clearfell and replant, with trying to diversify the species at time of replanting and taking all the gains you can get from genetic improvement of things like Sitka. And stand conditions, so if it's too wet or too exposed, I would find that difficult. Underthinned is the other one. We've got lots of examples of underthinning. You also see lots of times where you folk are commit to something being continuous cover and they never manage to do the thinning. You've really just got to let that run, and then the next rotation, clear felt and start again and try and get the thinning done the next time round. I've certainly seen in times when we were really hard up against it, trying to get a program achieved when the markets were really difficult, and we were trying to chase, late thinnings. We gave up. We thought, right, let those stands run. It's really much more important to get into those younger stands and start at the start, gets in. So we stopped chaser tail in the older stands and just went back into the younger stands and tried to get things started at as an early stage as possible. That's where you really want to be focusing your effort.
Okay, thanks. And then there's a policy, I think, related question coming from Martin McKinnon. Do forest regulators need to be doing more to promote CCF?
Good one, Martin. Yeah, I think the word patience comes in there, and it's a real challenge when the regulators are having to address things to be done in a 5-year time frame for grant aid and so on. It's a real dilemma. And it's that challenge around if the conditions, and I know there's a bit of scope within the grant scheme, but if conditions are right and things are starting to happen, then you can roll it on a bit longer. So I think it's that sort of having a bit of patience and being comfortable that the conditions are right and it will come, because it doesn't always come in that first 5 years. It doesn't come within that time window, and that can be a challenge. But you have to, as a regulator, you have to be seeing evidence that that the work's been done. B, you're starting to see signs. But you're also looking around the rest of the forest. Is browsing okay in the rest of the forest? Because if it's not okay in the rest of the forest, it's not going to be okay in that side. So I think it's looking at fairly holistically, but also having a bit of patience, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah. Charlie, then comment from question to Sam Negus, who was involved with some of your sample plots years back.
Yeah, I remember Sam.
The question is, good to hear about the move to CCF affected natural regeneration and the habitat. And what did you identify through the monitoring?
What was interesting, Sam, go back to what I said earlier in the talk about respond to what you see, but also sometimes you do need that overall monitoring. And the work you were involved with in Craigvinion and sort of doing it across the whole forest gives a very clear idea of A, where we were getting regen, and B, what type of regen. And in certain places we were hefting towards a surprise, if you like. There's a lot more conifers coming in some areas, and some of the other areas a lot more broadleaves, which you didn't necessarily pick up when you're sort of driving past or walking through. And so it's a really good sort of source of a kind of global picture, which then begins to allow you to think carefully about where you're going to start your next interventions and move forward. And also helps gather information on that sort of challenge about cleaning. And we did it in Craigvinion on a fairly intensive basis as a one-off. It's not the sort of thing we can afford to do everywhere else, and that's why we ended up moving to the beat team approach and getting folk to clean that information as best they could in rough maps and so on, so that the person carrying out the cleaning operation could go and focus there, if you like, with field visits on a narrower range of sites.
Charlie, I've got a question of my own. Going back to when you started at Craigvinion, I suppose one of the objectives was from a nature conservation point of view. And to what extent has your use of CCF in the district given conservationists a greater understanding of where you and colleagues are trying to take the forests in the future?
It probably has helped, Bill. Certainly, it's quite interesting when we've taken groups to Craigvinion in the past, and you'll stand in a Wellston Norway spruce stand beginning to regenerate with a wide range of species, and then you talk about, well, we have interesting choices here. This is woodland type is oak, upland oak woodland. And if we're following through in pause restoration, this would be going to oak. We've got grey squirrels in this area. So what do? Do we favour oak and grey squirrels, or do we maintain Norway spruce and favour red squirrels? So it's a real, we've got such a, I won't swear, but a mucked up ecology in this country that you do have to blur the boundaries between introduced species and native species, and this thing about productive, non-productive. Personally, I don't subscribe to it. There's certain places that are really special, like the Blackwood of Rannoch, where conservation has to be a key thing. Lots of other places, productive forests can be strong reservoirs of conservation, and and the more and continuous cover and certainly thinning is a big part of that. People rail against the upland conifer forests, and understandably so in the unthinned locations because they're not as diverse. But as you move into forests that are much more diverse of introduced conifers, they are astonishingly diverse. And most conservationists, I think, they have a preference for native, and they completely get that, but they can also see that there are benefits in these forests as well.
Okay, and I'll ask one more question of my own, and it might be worth you developing this a bit, because I know from talking to you in the past that your experience in the Charlottes, or Haida Gwaii as they're now called, was one of the things that opened your eyes to what you could do with upland conifer forests in this country. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, no, when I was in research many years ago, I had a 6-week trip to Washington and British Columbia, which included getting out to Haida Gwaii or Queen Charlotte Islands, and yeah, no, you see Douglas fir, 500-600 years old in the Washington area, and then you go up to Haida Gwaii and you drive through. I suppose I was driving through about 10 miles of smoking clear fells to get to the Sitka hemlock rainforest on the Reynolds Sound, and it was just astonishing. I'd never been anything like it in my life. I got lost in there for a couple of days. Classic rainforest, bald eagles everywhere, moss, ferns, dripping with moisture, and blazing sunshine outside. And then you step back out of that again into clear fell. And it was a real shock to my system. I thought, oh God, if I was in Canada at that time, I could not have been a so-called forester. They were mining the forest, and I came back from there thinking, yeah, we need to do more of this continuous cover forest with these species. These species, we tend to treat these. They were leaving snags on site that were bigger than the stuff we thought was massive trees here. We really haven't. We haven't got anywhere near having trees of a significant size yet. We're beginning to get there with some of our Douglas fir and Sitka spruce, but when you see these stands in those places, it will change your mind about these species. So if I had one gift to go as a part of the organisation, it would be really nice if the organisation was to send everybody there on a sabbatical for at least once in their career.
Okay. Well, I think I'll just wait to see if any final questions come in. Give people a few seconds to compose themselves. I don't see anything else coming in. So, Charlie, firstly, thank you very much for the webinar today. Really good, and your 8 lessons, which I'm sure Gary will be quoting in a talk next week or sometime soon. But more particularly on behalf of CCFG, I'd like to thank you for all your support over the years. And because you'll be retiring in the next month or so, look forward to seeing you at CCFG meetings in the future. But thanks for your support, and wish you all the best for your retirement.
Okay, thank you, Bill, and we'll see you at CCFG event in September in Scotland, hopefully.
Yeah. Cheers, Charlie.